He stood in the December snow and looked the man from Boston directly in the eye. Three mountain men, one gate that was not going to open, and a woman on the porch behind them who had come 2,000 miles to disappear. "I am the father," Eli Harlan said, quietly, without hesitation, as if it had always been true. The man with the lawyers and the money and the papers from Massachusetts stood very still. Then he put the envelope back in his pocket, turned around, and left Iron Ridge forever. But to understand why a man would say that you have to go back to a September afternoon 6 months earlier when a young woman stepped off a stagecoach in Millstone Creek with two small trunks, a letter worn soft at the folds, and a secret she was not yet ready to name. This is that story. Three men stood in the yard of the Iron Ridge Ranch on the afternoon of September the 4th, 1873, and none of them spoke. That was not unusual. The Harlan brothers had lived together long enough that silence between them had become something other than absence. It was a language of its own, spoken through the angle of a shoulder, the direction of a gaze, the particular way a man set his jaw when he was thinking something he had not yet decided to say out loud. Eli Harlan stood in the center, a coil of rope half finished in his large hands. He was 43 years old and looked it in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors tend to look their age, not worn down by time, but shaped by it, the way a piece of timber becomes more itself through decades of weather. His hair was dark chestnut, threaded with silver at the temples. His eyes were a pale amber color that could look gold or brown depending on the light. And right now, in the low angle of the Montana afternoon sun, they were fixed on the hired stagecoach that had pulled to a stop on the far side of the Cedar Gate. Seth Harlan stood to the left, a hand axe resting across one shoulder. He was 38 years old, the middle brother, and he had the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for peace. It was not peace. It was the watchfulness of a man who had learned at considerable personal cost that the world presented itself differently from how it actually was, and that the only reasonable response to that knowledge was to stop taking things at face value. Cole Harlan stood to the right. He was the youngest at 32 years of age, and he was the only one of the three who wore anything close to an expression of anticipation on his face. It was Cole who had spent 6 months persuading his eldest brother to place the advertisement in the Western Marriage Gazette. It was Cole who had argued that a house needed people living in it, not just people working in it. And it was Cole who was now standing in the autumn sunlight, wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake or a very good one. The stagecoach door opened. She stepped down, not gracefully and not awkwardly, but carefully, the way a person moves when they have learned that certain actions require more consideration than they used to. She was younger than Cole had expected, though the advertisement had specified no age requirements, and neither had her reply. Her hair was the color of honey left in a jar near a window, loosened from its arrangement by miles of travel. Her eyes, when she looked up and saw the three of them standing there, were a cornflower blue that held no particular surprise. She had, it seemed, prepared herself for whatever she might find. She was wearing a navy traveling dress that had been good quality once and still carried the ghost of that quality through the dust and the creases of 3 days on the road. She held a small bag close against her side. Behind her, the driver unloaded two modest trunks from the luggage rack, and the smallness of those trunks told a kind of story on their own. She stepped forward and then paused just for a moment in the way that people sometimes pause when crossing unfamiliar ground. One hand moved not consciously and not deliberately, but the way a hand moves when the body is checking on something important, something carried and protected. She laid her palm briefly against the front of her dress, a single second, perhaps less. Then she lifted her chin, adjusted her grip on the bag, and walked toward the gate. Eli Harlan saw it. He saw it, and he said nothing. And his face did not change, but somewhere behind his amber eyes, something shifted quietly and without announcement, like a stone that has been resting in one place for a long time, and then, with the passage of water over it, finds itself moved 1 inch to the left. He had seen that gesture before. He had seen it on a woman he loved on a morning in August at a kitchen table when everything in the world had still seemed possible. The memory arrived without invitation and departed just as quickly, leaving behind only the particular kind of ache that does not diminish with time, but simply becomes over the years more familiar, more manageable, never less real. Cole moved first. He stepped forward and lifted the latch on the cedar gate and pushed it open and extended his right hand as she approached. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I am Cole Harlan, the youngest. Eli sent me to bring you in." She took his hand. Her grip was firm and brief and entirely correct. "Mr. Harlan," she said. Her voice was low and even, a voice accustomed to keeping itself steady. Cole picked up both trunks as if they were empty and turned back toward the yard. Eli let the coil of rope fall to his side and walked toward her in the unhurried way of a man who had nowhere else to be and no particular performance to give. He stopped at a polite distance and looked at her the way you look at a piece of country you are about to cross, taking stock of the terrain, noting where the ground might be uncertain. "Miss Whitmore." 2 words. A statement, not a question. "Mr. Harlan." 2 words back. An acknowledgement. He nodded once, that was all. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and that was the entirety of their introduction. And it would take Clara Whitmore several weeks to understand that for Eli Harlan, it was also a kind of welcome. Before we go further into this story, if you are new here, please take a moment and subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week, and I would love to have you along for the journey. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are listening from tonight. I read every single one. Now, let us go back to where this story truly begins. Clara Whitmore had not planned to come to Montana Territory. She had not, if she was being completely honest with herself, planned much of anything for the past several months. Plans had become a luxury she could no longer afford, not since the morning in early August, when a woman with cool gray eyes in a very deliberate manner had pressed an envelope into her hands and informed her in language that was polite, precisely because politeness was a more effective weapon than anger, that her services were no longer required in the Aldrich household. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she was 22 years old, and she had been born in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, to a school teacher, father, and a seamstress mother who had both died of cholera within a week of each other 2 years prior. She had no siblings. She had no aunts or uncles she could call on. She had a small savings from 4 years of teaching and then working as a governess, and she had, upon her parents' death, applied for and been given a position in the home of the Aldrich family, one of Boston's more prosperous households, responsible for the education and daily care of their 2 younger children. She had done the work well. That was not the problem. The problem had arrived in the form of Clarence Aldrich, the eldest son, 28 years old, educated at considerable expense in the East, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes to men who have never been told no by anyone with the authority to make it matter. He had noticed her. She had tried not to be noticed. She had been quiet, professional, efficient, invisible when possible, present only when necessary. None of it had been sufficient. Some things are understood without being named in full, and what happened in that house in the spring of 1873 is one of them. What matters is what came after. What came after was Mrs. Aldrich and her cool gray eyes, in the envelope with money in it and the unspoken contract between them. Take this and go and say nothing, or stay and have nothing and still be expected to say nothing. Clara was not a fool. She took the envelope. She left before dawn the following morning with her 2 trunks and 3 months of wages, and a truth she was already learning to carry in a particular way, low and close, like something you cup in both hands to keep the wind from putting it out. She spent 3 weeks in a boarding house on a quiet street in the South End, the kind of establishment where people did not ask questions because everyone there had reasons not to want questions asked. In those 3 weeks, she counted her money twice each day and tried to think clearly about what her options were, and gradually, with the terrible clarity of a person who has eliminated every other possibility, she came to understand that she had essentially won. She needed to go somewhere that Clarence Aldrich would not follow. She needed to go there quickly enough that by the time she arrived, what she was already carrying would not yet be visible to the world. And she needed whatever she arrived at to be solid enough to stand on without constant maintenance. Montana Territory was in the summer of 1873, approximately 2,000 miles from Boston. 2,000 miles of iron rails and red dust and altitude and wilderness so complete that a person could disappear into it, not because they were hiding, but simply because the land itself had no interest in anyone's history. This was what Clara needed, not sympathy, not rescue, just distance, in the kind of silence that had nothing to do with secrets and everything to do with space. She found the advertisement on a Wednesday evening. She had been sitting in her small room at the boarding house with a copy of the Western Marriage Gazette that had been left in the hallway by a previous tenant, reading without particular purpose when she came across a notice in the back pages. It was short. There were no embellishments, no promises of beauty or companionship or adventure in the Great West. It read, "I am Eli Harlan. I own a ranch at Iron Ridge, Montana Territory. I am looking for a wife who knows how to work. I will treat you with decency." That was all. She read it twice. Then she read the longer advertisements around it, the ones that promised comfortable homes and kind hearts in the grand adventure of the frontier. And she found that none of them told her anything she believed. The short one told her three things she could actually use. The man had a ranch, which meant land and shelter and the basic materials of survival. He was willing to say honestly that it was hard work, which meant he was not the kind of man who hid difficult truths behind pleasant words. And he had used the word decency, not love, not companionship, not happiness. Decency. At that particular moment in her life, decency was not the consolation prize. It was the thing she needed most. She wrote back the following morning. He replied in 12 days. She bought her train ticket to Helena the week after that. The journey from Boston to Millstone Creek took 11 days, counting the river crossing and the overnight delay outside Bismarck when a section of track washed out. Clara ate sparingly from what she had packed, not from shortage, but from caution rationing everything the way she had been rationing everything lately. Her words, her expressions, her energy keeping as much in reserve as possible for a destination she had not yet seen. The mornings were the hardest part of the journey, but she had already learned to manage them. She woke before the other passengers and sat with her forehead against the window glass and breathed through it, counting slowly, letting the discomfort pass, which it always did by mid-morning, reliable as a tide. What she could not control, she could outlast. That had become her governing principle. She watched the land change outside the windows. The green density of New England giving way to the flat, wide enormity of the Midwest, and then the Midwest opening into something grander and more indifferent, the kind of country that did not notice you passing through it. The mountains appeared on the third day west of Bismarck, distant and blue and enormous, and she pressed her forehead against the glass and looked at them for a long time. They did not know about Boston. They did not know about the Aldrich family or what Clarence had done or what she was carrying because of it. They were simply there as they had been there long before any of the current arrangements of human trouble, and they would be there long after. She found that more comforting than she had expected. Millstone Creek was a town that had been assembled rather than built, the kind of place that came into existence because the land required a certain minimum density of commerce and service and had grown exactly as much as that requirement demanded and no further. One main street, a general store, a telegraph office, a small hotel with a painted sign that needed repainting. A blue house at the far end with a large stand of sage in the front that smelled sharp and clean in the September heat. Cole Harlan was leaning against the post outside the post office when the stagecoach arrived. He looked up when she stepped down with the particular attention of a man who has been told to look for a young woman in a navy dress and has been doing exactly that for the better part of an hour. He was tall, considerably taller than anything she was accustomed to in Boston, with auburn hair that caught the late afternoon light and dark, warm eyes that held no calculation in them. He picked up both her trunks without ceremony and walked them to the wagon. "It is 3 hours from here," he said, climbing up to the driver's bench and offering her a hand up beside him. "The road is rough for the first hour and then better. I apologize in advance for the first hour." "I have had 11 days on a train," she said. I believe I can manage. He glanced at her sideways with something that might have been a smile if he had let it go that far. Then he clicked at the two horses, and the wagon moved forward into the afternoon. They talked some on the road and were quiet some, and neither felt the need to fill the quiet with more words than the quiet deserved. Cole described the ranch honestly and without embellishment, which she appreciated. He said that Eli was a good man, but not an easy one to know that all three brothers had been on the land since their father died 9 years ago, that the ranch had been through some difficult years, but was standing. He told her the winters were serious affairs that required preparation and respect. He did not mention not then what had happened to the woman who had lived in that house before. Some stories belonged to the person who had lived them, and he would let Eli tell her that if Eli ever chose to. Is there anything you would like to know? Cole said somewhere along the middle stretch of road, where the pines grew thick enough on both sides that the light came through in long, pale strip before we get there. She considered the question seriously. Is he a fair man? Cole thought about it the same way with no rush to give an answer before the answer was ready. Yes, he said at last. He is. It may not always look like fairness from the outside. He does not have a lot of soft edges, but he is fair. She nodded and turned back to watch the mountains ahead. Iron Ridge takes care of its own. Cole said not as a sales pitch, but as a piece of information he believed to be true. That is the only way I know how to put it. She filed that away and said nothing, but she did not forget it. The ranch appeared at the end of a long, downward curve in the road, tucked into a wide, shallow valley with the Iron Ridge Mountains standing to the north like a wall of dark stone and the pine forest pressing in on the other three sides. Clara saw it first as a collection of shapes against the hillside, and then as the wagon descended as something more specific. A two-story log house with a cedar shake roof, a barn larger than the house, a network of fencing that ran out in several directions and disappeared into the tree line, a stone well near the center of the yard, and a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that had once been laid out with care and intention, the remnants of careful rows still visible beneath the weeds that had reclaimed it over what she estimated was at least 2 full seasons. The structure of it was still there, the ordered lines, the thought behind the arrangement, surviving under the neglect like a blueprint under paint. Someone had known how to tend a garden once. Someone had done it with enough persistence that the evidence of it remained. She filed that alongside everything else she was filing. Harlan was standing at the corner of the barn, and she had known in the abstract sense that you know a thing before you have seen it, that the man who wrote in short sentences and used words like decency was unlikely to be the sort of man who rushed toward new arrivals with open arms. She had not quite prepared herself for the scale of him in the same way that you can know intellectually that a mountain is large and still be unprepared for it when you are standing at its base. He was tall in the way that men who are also very broad are tall, not long and narrow, but simply large, taking up space as if the space had always been designed to accommodate him. His face was the face of a man who had spent 4 decades outdoors, honestly aged the lines of it going where they went without apology. He watched the wagon approach without moving. When it stopped, he set down the rope he had been working and walked toward them. His eyes found her immediately, and they were sharp in a way that was not unkind but was absolutely unsentimental. She had the distinct feeling of being read like a piece of land measured and assessed with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had learned that first impressions were worth taking seriously. She got down from the wagon before he reached her. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in the way of a person who has decided that whatever happens next, she will meet it standing up. Miss Whitmore. His voice was low and unhurried and gave nothing away. Mr. Harlan. She gave nothing away either. He nodded once, that was all. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and she stood in the yard with 2 trunks and a bin, in the particular understanding that she had just been assessed by a man who did not waste his assessments. Then Seth Harlan came around the corner of the house with a hand axe in his belt, and the afternoon became something else entirely. He stopped when he saw her and did not change his expression. His eyes were a pale gray blue, sharp and winter clear, and they moved over her face in a way that was different from his elder brother's assessment. Where Eli's look had been measuring, Seth's was examining. He was looking for something specific, searching for a thing he expected to find or expected not to find, and she could not tell yet which outcome he was hoping for. "Trunks go upstairs," he said to Cole, not to her. Then to her, "Room is on the right. Supper is at 6. He went inside. Cole caught her eye with an expression that communicated both apology and reassurance without being entirely either. "He is not bad," Cole said quietly. "He just needs time." She had heard that said about difficult men before, and she was too tired to make a judgment about it yet. So she said nothing and carried her bag toward the door. Her room was at the top of the stairs on the right, practical and spare with a single bed, a small table and chair, a washstand with a ceramic basin and one window that looked west toward the mountains. No decorations, no curtains, nothing that indicated the room had ever belonged to a specific person. It was a room that had been emptied and left that way, whether by grief or indifference or simple utility, she could not yet determine. She stood at the window for a moment. The mountains caught the last of the afternoon light in a way that made them look closer than they were, the ridgelines going orange, and then dark red, and then a deep bruised purple as the sun dropped behind the western range. Montana territory, 2,000 miles from Boston. The distance felt physical, like something she could measure in her body. She washed her face and hands from the basin, changed into a clean dress, and went downstairs at 6. Supper was beef stew and boiled potatoes made for the purpose of nourishment rather than pleasure, which was not a complaint, just an observation. The four of them sat around the table, and the silence was a fifth presence among them. Not hostile, not the silence that follows an argument or precedes one, but simply the silence of people who did not know each other yet and were not going to pretend otherwise. Cole made one attempt at conversation, and Seth responded with a single syllable, and that was the entirety of the table talk. After supper, Clara helped clear and wash the dishes without being asked. Seth watched this without comment. Cole gave her a small nod that indicated approval. Eli was already gone from the room. She went upstairs before full dark and lay in the narrow bed with the quilt pulled up and the window letting in the first cold of a Montana autumn night. She could hear the creak, which she had noticed from the wagon, a constant low sound like a voice just below the range of comprehension, saying something over and over that you could hear but not quite make out. 10 weeks, she calculated, give or take. She had done this calculation so many times that it had become involuntary, a reflex, like checking a door is locked. She was not frightened exactly. She had passed through the place where fear lived and come out on the other side into something flatter and more determined, a landscape without dramatic features but with clear sight lines in all directions. She knew what she was doing. She knew the risks. She had done the only thing there was to do, and now she was here in this spare room in this strange house at the end of a road that most people in Boston did not know existed. "Winter always ends," she said quietly to the dark and to herself. "Whatever it is, winter always ends." Then she closed her eyes, and within 10 minutes, for the first time and longer than she could properly calculate, she slept. She woke before dawn. This was not new. She'd been waking before dawn for months now, the way a person wakes when the body has learned to stay alert even in sleep, one part of the mind always keeping watch. She lay still for a moment in the gray dark and listened to the ranch, the creek, wind at the eaves, below the deep silence of a house where everyone else was still sleeping. She rose carefully and dressed in the dark by feel hands, finding the buttons in the order she knew them, the way she had done in boarding houses and temporary rooms ever since her parents died. She carried her boots down the stairs rather than wearing them, testing each board before she put her weight down. The kitchen was cold. The stove held the last of last night's heat in a thin layer of warm ash. She found the wood box beside the back door and the kindling below it, and she rebuilt the fire the way her mother had taught her, tinder first, then kindling laid across it at angles to let the air move through, then the smaller split wood, and then the logs. It took 15 minutes to get a proper blaze going, and the old cast iron stove ticked and pinged as the metal expanded. She found the coffee on the second shelf of the pantry, coarsely ground, the kind that a wood stove made strong and honest in a way that no other method could quite replicate. The pot hung on its iron hook above the stove. She filled it from the water bucket and set it to heat. Then she found the cornmeal at the back of the pantry, deep behind tins of salt and dried beans, and she thought about those tins the same way she had thought about the garden. Here was evidence of a time when someone had stocked this pantry with care, and then a time when the stocking had stopped and the food had sat there accruing dust and waiting. Someone had been gone from here. Not physically gone, not entirely, but gone in the way that people go when they lose what makes a house into a home. She mixed the cornbread by memory, no measuring, just the knowledge that lived in her hands from years of standing in a kitchen alongside women who had taught her without making a lesson of it. She set it in the iron skillet at the edge of the stove, where the heat was steady but not fierce. By the time the eastern sky through the kitchen window had shifted from black to the pale, colorless gray that precedes even the first pink of dawn, the coffee was ready and the cornbread was set, and the kitchen smelled for the first time in what must have been years, like a place where someone intended to remain. Cole came down first. She heard him in the hallway, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the coffee pot on the stove. He looked at the skillet. Then he looked at her again, and something crossed his face that she recognized as the expression of a person receiving something they had been missing without having quite named it as a missing thing. "Oh," he said, a small word with a great deal inside it. Seth came next, carrying the weight of recent sleep and moving at his customary pace, which adjusted for no one. He looked at her, looked at the stove, then crossed the kitchen without comment and sat at the table. She could not precisely read his face, but it was not dismissal and it was not hostility, and those two things were enough for now. She set the mugs on the table, and then Eli came down. Heavy, even footsteps on the stairs unhurried the sound of a man with considerable weight behind each step. Then quiet. Then she was aware of him standing in the kitchen doorway, and she did not turn around immediately because she was still pouring the coffee, and she finished pouring before she turned. He was standing very still, not with surprise exactly, but with something more contained than surprise, something that had the shape of surprise but had been managed down into stillness before it could show fully. His amber eyes moved from her to the table to the stove and back to her, and what passed through them in that brief passage she could not name with certainty, but she recognized it the way you recognize a word in a foreign language that you have not spoken in years, somewhere between understanding and the effort of understanding. He crossed the kitchen and sat at the head of the table. He wrapped both hands around the mug, the way a man wraps his hands around something warm when he has been cold for a long time, not with urgency but with thoroughness, and he lifted it and drank. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence that falls after something has happened that will need to be thought about at length. Cole ate his cornbread without making anything of it. Seth drank his coffee in even considered sips. Clara stood at the stove and allowed herself to be no more and no less than she was in that moment, which was a woman who had risen before dawn to light someone else's fire, and had done so not because she was told to, but because she understood what a cold stove in a working house meant. Eli set the mug down when it was empty. He pushed back his chair, stood, and as he passed through the kitchen doorway on his way to the yard, he said, without turning around, without slowing, "Iron Ridge takes care of its own. You did right." The door closed behind him. Cole looked at his cornbread. Seth looked at the table. Neither of them said anything, because in this house, that was how you allowed something to count. In the days that followed, Clara worked. She began with what was most obviously neglected and moved methodically from there. The hen house first, because it told her immediately what she needed to know about the rhythm of a working ranch, and because hens are uncomplicated judges of competence. The floor was thick with old straw, and the hens had been laying wherever they felt like it in corners, and under the nesting shelf, and in one ambitious case on a fence post, which she took as a sign of a poultry operation that had been given too much independence for too long. She spent 2 hours in there. She cleaned and rebedded and reset the nesting boxes the way her mother had taught her, dark and low and set apart, because hens lay better when they feel they have made a deliberate choice about it. By the time she emerged into the late morning sun, she had a basket of 11 eggs and the particular satisfaction of a person who has put a disorderly thing into order. Seth walked past while she was carrying the basket toward the house. He glanced at it. He said nothing. But he looked at the hen house for just a moment before he continued on the way. A man looks at something he has been meaning to deal with for a while and has just been dealt with by someone else. The new hoe appeared the following morning. It was leaning against the kitchen wall near the back door lighter and recently sharpened, and no one mentioned it, and she did not ask about it. She took it out to the garden. The garden was going to take time. The weeds had had at least 2 full seasons to establish themselves, and some of them had root systems that went down 8 inches or more. She began at the nearest corner and worked inward, not rushing, not trying to accomplish it all in one day, because gardens that are hurried recover poorly. She had time. She intended to use it correctly. Eli passed the garden that first afternoon on his way to the barn and slowed. He looked at the section she had cleared, roughly a quarter of the nearest bed, the dark turned earth sitting in contrast against the surrounding tangle. He stood there for a moment, she noticed, without acknowledging, and then he walked on. The next morning he was out there himself in the far half of the garden with a spade, and he worked in silence while she worked from her end, and neither of them commented on this arrangement, and between the two of them, they cleared an entire bed by noon. She cooked, she cleaned, she managed the kitchen with the steady, practical competence of a woman who had been feeding other people since she was old enough to hold a pot without scalding herself. She made things from what was in the pantry, discovering as she went the full inventory of what was there, and noting mentally what was absent, building a picture of a household that had been maintained at survival level for a long time without anyone taking particular pleasure in the maintaining. Supper became something the table gathered around with slightly more attention. Not that anyone said so, but Cole stopped pretending to read his newspaper while eating. Seth stayed at the table after finishing his meal, something he had not done on the first evening. Eli drank a second cup of coffee. These were small things. She understood, with the instinct of a woman who had spent 4 years reading rooms and people and the spaces between what was said and what was meant, that they were also significant things. On the third day, on an afternoon when the light was long and golden over the ranch, and the air had the particular clarity that Montana autumn produces, as if in apology for the winter terror. It is about to deliver. Clara was collecting eggs in the hen house and did not notice Eli standing in the yard until she straightened too fast and felt the brief familiar swimming of her vision and put one hand on the wall to steady herself. It passed in under a second. She straightened, smoothed her apron, continued with the basket, and when she came out of the hen house, the yard was empty. She thought nothing more of it. But that afternoon, while she was working in the cleared section of the garden, her attention directed at a particularly stubborn root system in the northeast corner, her body did what it sometimes did without consulting her intentions. Her hand moved to rest low against the front of her dress. Not for long and not deliberately, just the instinctive checking motion of a person carrying something they cannot afford to lose track of, a hand laid flat as if to confirm, yes, still, they're still. All right. She did not see Eli standing at the kitchen window. He had gone in to retrieve his tools from the side cabinet, and he was crossing the kitchen when he passed the window, as he sometimes did in the afternoon, to take a brief reading of the day, and he saw her in the garden with the afternoon light at a low angle behind her and her hand resting against her abdomen. 1 second, perhaps 2, then her hand dropped and she went back to the work. He stood very still at the kitchen window for longer than the moment required. He had seen it before. He knew what it meant. He had known what it meant the first time too, on a morning that felt both very long ago and very close, depending on the day and the quality of the light. Margaret had done it the same way, not consciously and not as a signal, just the body's private language. the hand that checks on what the heart has already staked everything on. He had put her in a wagon in the dark of a March morning with snow on the ground and driven as fast as the road allowed, which was not fast enough because the road had done what Montana roads did in the season of the melt, and the drive that should have taken 40 minutes had taken nearly 2 hours, and she had arrived at the hospital in Helena alive, and she had not come back out. Neither had the child. He had driven home alone at 2 in the morning on a road he could not see in a wagon that still smelled of her, and the silence inside his chest from that night had never fully lifted. He stood at the kitchen window and felt that memory move through him the way weather moves across the land, not asking permission and not offering warning, simply arriving with the particular weight of it and then passing. Then he set down the tools and stood for another moment thinking with the stillness of a man who does not make decisions quickly, but who, when he makes them, keeps them. The young woman in his garden had come here from somewhere else with very little. She had not told him the full truth, and he understood why, because he had known what she was concealing from the day she arrived and had given her the space to keep that concealment while she found her footing. She worked without being asked and did not make a production of it. She had made coffee before anyone thought to ask her to, and she had made it correctly, and she had done it again every morning since. She had dug out half a garden in 3 days. She had fed the chickens and reorganized the hen house and cooked 3 meals a day without complaint, and she had not in all that time asked for a single thing beyond what the house already had. What she was carrying was not his. He knew that. He was not in the business of pretending otherwise. But what she was carrying was also small and unprotected and had not done anything wrong. And the winter was 8 weeks away, and the nearest town was 15 miles on a road that in March would be uncertain at best. He went back outside. He picked up the hoe he had sharpened 2 nights ago and leaned it against the fence near where Clara was working, where she would see it without having to search for it, and he went to the far end of the garden and continued clearing. Neither of them spoke, but something had settled between them that evening, wordless and consequential, the way certain agreements are made in the country without need for language, because language would only make them smaller. Seth Harlan had been watching longer than anyone knew. He was not a man who announced his observations. He collected them and held them and waited to see which direction the evidence pointed before he committed to any conclusion. It was a way of seeing the world that had cost him considerable warmth over the years, but it had also 7 years ago been the wall that kept him standing when a woman named Violet had taken 3 years of his savings and walked out of Millstone Creek on a Tuesday morning without looking back. He had been too slow to see it then. He had no intention of being too slow again. He had noticed the morning sickness before Clara thought anyone had. The particular way she stood at the stove some mornings, very still breathing carefully with a control that was too practiced to be accidental. The way she ate at supper, measured and deliberate, taking slightly less than a working person in her situation required. The careful, canted way she rose from a low crouch. The way she occasionally went very still in the middle of a task and then after a moment continued. He had noticed the hand. He had seen it in the garden on the same afternoon that Eli had seen it from the kitchen window, but Seth had seen it from the corner of the barn, where he had been oiling the hinge on the tack room door, a task that did not actually need doing, but had given him a convenient reason to be in that part of the yard at that particular time. He was not certain, not yet, but the evidence was assembling itself in a direction that required him to say something, because Eli was his brother, and this was his house. And whatever was building here, whatever quiet arrangement was forming between the woman in the garden and the oldest Harlan brother, who had spent 3 years closing himself off from everything that had the capacity to hurt him, Seth had a responsibility to know the truth before it went further than either of them could easily walk back from. The question was when and how to ask it, and how to ask it in a way that was fair to the truth without being cruel to the person who was carrying it. He was still working through that calculation that evening at supper, watching Clara pass the bread to Cole and Eli refill his coffee, and the kitchen hold the warmth it now held every evening, in a way it had not held it before she came. And he was thinking about what fairness required of a man, when fairness and loyalty, and the complicated truth of what a house needed were all pointing in slightly different directions. He went to sleep that night with the question unresolved. He lay in the dark of his room, listening to the creek below the property and the wind in the ridge pines, and he thought about what decency looked like when the situation was not simple, and he turned it over and over in the way of a man who has been wrong before and has no interest in being wrong again in either direction. He did not know yet what he would say to her when the morning came, but he knew what he was going to do when it did. On the other side of the thin log wall in the room that had not belonged to anyone since Margaret died, Clara Whitmore lay with her hand flat against her abdomen and listened to the same creak, the same wind, the same dark house settling into the cold night around her. And she thought about a short advertisement in a back page of a back issue of a newspaper that had been left in a boarding house hallway for anyone who happened to need it. She thought about a man who used the word decency and meant it in exactly the way she needed it to be meant. She thought about a kitchen that had smelled of cold ash for 3 years and now smelled of coffee every morning. Winter always ends, she thought. Whatever it is, winter always ends. The mountains did not answer, but they had been standing against harder questions than this for 10,000 years, and they were still standing, and that in its way was all the answer that the night required. Seth Harlan knocked on the barn door at 7 in the morning on the 7th day after Clara arrived, and he did not knock the way a person knocks when they are uncertain whether they will be welcome. He knocked the way a man knocks when he has thought about something long enough and reached the point where thinking alone will no longer serve him. Clara was inside measuring out the morning feed for the 3 horses in the row stalls, a task Cole had shown her 2 days prior with the relaxed efficiency of a man who assumes that if you show a person something once and they are paying attention, they will not need to be shown again. She had been paying attention. The horses had confirmed this by accepting her presence with the calm of animals who have no strong feelings either way about who brings their breakfast provided it arrives. She heard the knock and the door open, and Seth filled the frame, the way Seth always filled doorways, not dramatically but completely, the breath of him occupying the available space as a fact rather than a gesture. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Harlan. She did not stop what she was doing. She finished measuring and tipped the grain into the nearest trough and set the scoop down before she turned. He stepped inside and let the door swing partially closed behind him. He stood with his arms at his sides, which was how Seth Harlan stood when he was being deliberate when he had made the decision that this conversation would happen and had removed from his posture everything that was not strictly necessary. His pale gray eyes were direct and entirely without cruelty, which was something she noted and filed carefully because the absence of cruelty in a hard conversation is not a small thing. "I'm going to ask you a question," he said. "I want a straight answer." "Ask it. Are you with child?" The silence after it was the kind that has a texture that presses against the walls of the space it inhabits. The horses moved softly in their stalls. Outside, the wind found the gap between the barn boards and made its low note through them. Clara did not look away. She had thought in the night since arriving about what she would say when this moment came because she had always known it would come, had counted on it coming sooner rather than later. Because these were observant men in a way that city men generally were not, men whose survival had for decades depended on their ability to read the land and the weather and the creatures around them with accuracy and without sentiment. She had thought about deflecting. She had thought about partial truths. She had arrived over the course of those nights at the same conclusion each time. "Yes," she said. Seth breathed in once through his nose. His jaw moved in the small way of a man who has been confirmed in a thing he was not entirely glad to be confirmed in. "You came here knowing this." "I did." "With what intention?" "To work," she said, "to earn my place, to give the child somewhere to come into the world that is not a boarding house or a charity ward or a situation where someone with money and lawyers will be able to take it from me the moment it arrives." She kept her voice level the way she kept many things level by holding them steady from the inside. "I did not come to deceive your brethren. I came because I had no other direction to go, and this one had a man who said he would treat me decently, and that was worth more to me at that point than I can explain to you in simple terms." Seth was quiet for a moment. His eyes were doing their examining again, moving over her face with the patience of someone who is not satisfied with surface readings. "The Father," he said, "is he looking for you?" Something shifted in her expression, small and quickly controlled. "I do not know," she said. "Not yet. But it is possible. It is possible." He looked at her for another long moment. Then something changed, not softened exactly, but recalibrated the way the setting on a scale adjusts when new information has been placed on it. "I am going to tell Eli," he said. "I know. He deserves to know the full situation before he is any further into it." "Yes," she said, "he does." Seth looked at her for one more moment, and she held his gaze, and neither of them flinched. And that was the end of the conversation. He turned and pushed through the barn door, and she stood in the near dark with the horses moving around her and her heart doing what hearts do when the thing you have been waiting for has finally arrived and is no longer in the waiting, but in the present tense, which is always harder. She went back to feeding the horses. It was the only reasonable thing to do. Seth found Eli in the north pasture resetting a fence post that had heaved out of the ground with the first frost. The work required a maul and considerable force and a certain quality of focused physical attention that was one of the few things in Eli Harlan's experience that functioned as a reliable substitute for thinking. He had been at it for an hour. Seth stood at the edge of the cleared ground and said what he had to say in the direct, stripped-down manner he applied to everything that mattered, no preamble and no softening. He told his brother what he had found and what Clara had confirmed and what he thought the implications were. Eli let him finish. He set them all down in the grass and stood with his hands on the top rail of the fence he had just reset, looking north at the ridge that gave the ranch its name, which was doing what it always did in the early autumn morning, standing there. "I know," he said. Seth went very still. "Since when?" "Second day." The silence between the brothers had a specific quality to it. The silence of two men who have lived long enough in each other's company to understand what is being communicated below the surface of what is being said. "You knew and said nothing," Seth said. It was not an accusation. It was a question dressed as a statement. "I was thinking." And Eli turned the post top in his hand once. "She stays." Seth exhaled through his nose, the sound of a man who is absorbing a decision rather than contesting it. "She is carrying another man's child." "She is," Eli said. "The child did not choose that, neither did she by the look of it." He turned from the fence and picked up the maul. "She has been here a week. She lit the fire before anyone was awake. She cleared a quarter of that garden in 2 days. She cooked food worth eating without being asked and has not made a production of any of it." He looked at his brother. "She is not what you are afraid she is." Seth was quiet. "She is not Violet," Eli said. "And I will not manage this house or this decision through the lens of a thing that happened 7 years ago to a different man in a different situation." Seth held his brother's gaze for a moment, measuring. Then he looked away toward the tree line and was quiet for a while. "The Father might come," he said. "Then we will deal with that when it comes." "And the arrangement, the advertisement." "The arrangement stands," Eli said. "As long as she is willing and able. She came here looking for decent ground. This is decent ground." He hefted the maul. "She stays. That is the decision." Seth stood for another moment in the autumn morning, turning it over with the thoroughness he applied to everything. Then, not warmly, but with the particular weight of a man whose word means something precisely because he does not give it casually. "All right." He walked back toward the barn. Eli drove the post 3 more times, with the maul harder than necessary, and then stood looking at the result and let the mountain morning be what it was around him. He told Clara that evening, sitting on the rear porch after supper, while Cole washed the dishes inside and Seth had gone to check the gate latches, which was something Seth did when he needed to be alone with a decision he had already made and was in the process of making peace with. He told her she was staying. He told her the arrangement was not changed. He asked her in plain terms to tell him as much of the truth as she was able to about the Father and the risk of pursuit because he needed to understand the full shape of what they were dealing with. He said this not as a condition, but as a practical matter, the way a man consults a map before he begins a journey he cannot turn back from. She told him most of it, not the hardest parts, not yet, but the architecture of it, the shape, and the danger in the name. Clarence Aldrich, she said, Boston, a family with money and the kind of connections that money keeps. She had left without telling anyone where she was going, but she was not certain that would be enough. Eli listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he sat for a moment in the particular quality of quiet that characterized him at his most serious, which was not like the quiet of a man with nothing to say, but the quiet of a man with a great deal to say who is choosing carefully. Is there a doctor here, she said, or someone who handles this sort of thing? Someone who knows about women and children. Martha Goodwin, he said, in Millstone Creek. She has been the midwife in this county for 40 years. She will not ask you for more than you want to give, and she will not repeat what you tell her. He looked at her. We will go tomorrow morning if the weather holds. She nodded. And the arrangement, he said. You understand what I mean when I say it stands. I understand, she said. He stood from the porch rail. Iron Ridge takes care of its own, he said, with the quietness of a man stating a thing he has believed for a long time. That includes what you are carrying. He went inside. Clara sat on the porch in the cooling dark and listened to the creek below the property, and did not try to hold everything she was feeling in any organized way. Just let it exist in whatever shape it needed to exist, in which was not one shape, but many layered and overlapping and not entirely nameable. After a while, the feeling settled into something simpler. Not happiness exactly, not relief. Something underneath both of those. Something closer to the sensation of solid ground. They rode into Millstone Creek the following morning, Eli on the buckskin and Clara on the smaller roan that Cole had saddled for her before light and pronounced steady enough for the road, which turned out to be an accurate assessment. The sky was clear and cold and very blue, and the mountain light came in at the low, flat angle of autumn, turning everything it touched briefly and specifically golden before moving on. They rode mostly without talking. The road demanded attention in certain sections, and in others it was simply road-red dirt between green walls of pine, and in those sections she was aware of his presence beside her, not as an intrusion, but as a kind of anchor, a fixed point in a landscape that was still new enough to feel slightly unreal. Near the edge of town, she said, You do not have to wait if you have business. I will wait, he said, with the finality of a man who has already decided this and does not find it worth revisiting. Martha Goodwin's house was at the far end of the main street, blue, painted with a front yard full of sage that smelled clean and sharp in the morning air. Martha herself opened the door before they reached it, a small woman with white hair and large, capable hands, and eyes so sharp that looking into them felt briefly like being assessed by something ancient and practical and in no hurry. She looked at Clara for 2 seconds and then at Eli and said, Come in, girl. Eli, you can wait outside. Eli sat down on the porch steps and put his hat on his knee and looked at the quiet street of Millstone Creek with the patience of a man who has spent his life waiting on things that required waiting. Inside, in a room that smelled of dried herbs and old wood, in the particular clean scent of a place where difficult things had been faced with competence across many years, Martha Goodwin asked her questions with the directness of a woman who understood that clarity was a form of kindness. She did not ask for more than she needed. She did not offer judgment either way. She listened to what Clara told her, all of it this time, more than she had told Eli on the porch the previous evening, and the older woman absorbed it in the unhurried way of someone who has heard versions of most human troubles and has learned that the specific details matter less than the person telling them. 10 weeks, Martha said when the examination was done. Maybe 11. The child is well. You are thin and you are tired in a way that is more than walking, but that is manageable. She reached up and set both hands briefly at Clara's temples. Her eyes closed, something private passing through the gesture. Then she opened her eyes and sat back. You need more food than you have been allowing yourself, more sleep, and you need to stop pretending that the heavy work does not cost you more than it used to. I will, Clara said. That is not a question of will, Martha said without unkindness. It is a question of arithmetic. Your body is doing two jobs now. You cannot indefinitely give it the resources for one and expect both to continue. She went to the back room and returned with a small cloth pouch. Steep this in hot water every morning. Take it slow. It will help with the sickness. She sat down across from Clara and looked at her with those old sharp eyes. The man outside. He knows. He knows. And he is keeping you. He is. Martha was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite sadness, but something in the territory between the two, the expression of a woman who has watched human beings surprise each other for 7 decades and has not tired of it. He lost a wife in childbirth 3 years ago, she said softly. Margaret. She was a good woman and he was a good husband to her, and the loss was the kind that does not finish. She looked at Clara steadily. I am not telling you this for any reason except that you should understand what you are standing in the middle of. What you are carrying will not be simple for him, but he is keeping you, which means he has decided to be larger than his grief, which is not a small thing. Clara looked at the window and at the light coming through it and thought about the kitchen and the coffee and the garden and the hoe that had appeared without explanation against the wall. I know, she said quietly. Martha walked her to the door. On the porch, she looked at Eli sitting on the bottom step and said simply, She is well. The child is well. Make sure she eats. Then she went back inside because Martha Goodwin did not linger at the edges of other people's important moments. Eli stood and offered his hand to help her down the step, in open palm unhurried, making no more of it than it was. She took it and stepped down, and he released it without ceremony, and they walked to the horses. They were a mile out of town when she said, I should have told you before I came. He was quiet for a moment, the horses finding their own pace on the familiar road. Then he said words that came out of him the way things come out of very reserved men, slowly and with considerable weight behind them. I knew already. Earlier. She looked at him. How early? The day you arrived. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. The Waka stepped down from the coach, a gesture. He paused. I had seen it before. She understood what he meant by that without needing him to complete the sentence, because she had been told about Margaret that morning, and she was not a woman who needed things explained to her twice. You knew from the first day, she said, and you let me stay. I let you stay. The pine forest moved past them on both sides, the light coming through in long columns that fell across the road, and their horses and the red dirt in alternating patterns of warmth and shade. Why, she said not accusingly, but the way a person asks when the answer matters. He considered it in his particular way, giving the question the time it deserved. The child needed solid ground, he said at last, and a person who does not have solid ground under them cannot be expected to behave as if they do. He looked at her then briefly and directly. You had no solid ground. You needed somewhere to stand before anything else could happen. This place can be that. She looked at the road ahead and did not speak for a while. Iron Ridge takes care of its own, he said, not as a reminder, but as a completion of something he had begun on the first day and was now finishing. She heard it land and let it stay where it landed. The days built themselves one on top of the other in the way that the best days do, through accumulation rather than declaration. Clara worked, and the work was real and physical and satisfying in the way that work with tangible results is satisfying, which is a different kind of satisfaction than the work she had done in the Aldrich house, where the results were always invisible and the standards were always shifting. She finished clearing the garden. It took 6 days in total, and by the end of it, there was dark-turned earth, where there had been tangle and disorder, and the rows were visible again, the intention of the original design readable beneath the seasons of neglect. She found some late-season root vegetables still in the ground, parsnips and turnips that had survived by going deep, and she harvested them and made them into things. She learned the ranch by moving through it. She learned which gate latches needed lifting slightly before they would open, which window in the kitchen let the wind through when the wind was from the north, and therefore needed a folded cloth wedged into the frame, which board in the upstairs hallway spoke in the night when the house contracted in the cold, and which ones were silent. She learned the horses by name and temperament. She learned that the chickens had established a social order among themselves that was complicated and absolute, and that interfering with it produced poor results for everyone involved. Cole taught her things. He did it in the way of the Harlan brothers generally, without making a lesson of it, simply doing a thing alongside her and saying what was useful to say about it and nothing more. He showed her how to read the soil's moisture by pressing a pinch of it between her thumb and forefinger, how to tell the difference between frostbite on plant roots, and simple day back how to read the ridge for incoming weather. He was easy to be around in a way that his brothers, excellent men. Both of them were not quite, and she was grateful for him, in a way she did not express directly, because expressing things directly was not the primary language of this house, but she expressed it by paying attention when he spoke, and by being honestly glad of his company, which he seemed to understand. Seth brought her things. This was how he operated, and it took her a while to recognize it as generosity, because it did not look like generosity from the outside. It looked like objects appearing in places where they had not been before. The lighter hoe. A water bucket without the small split in the base that had been causing the old one to lose a cup of water per filling. A lantern left at the bottom of the stairs on the first evening. She had mentioned in passing without complaint that the stairwell was dark after sunset. He never said anything about any of these provisions, and neither did she, and the silence around them was a kind of contract between two people who had both independently concluded that some things were better expressed through function than through speech. She was coming to understand that silence in this house was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who were saying things in a register that words were not always sufficient for. She was learning that register slowly and carefully, the way you learn a dialect by listening more than speaking and making mistakes occasionally and adjusting. On a Tuesday morning in the third week, she went down to the creek to do the washing. The path was steep, a narrow track through tall grass with pine roots crossing the red dirt at intervals, and she went down slowly with the wash bucket in one hand and the other touching the branches of the lower shrubs for balance. The air changed as she descended, becoming cooler and denser, carrying the smell of moving water and the shade of things that did not get full sun. The creek was not wide, perhaps 8 feet at its broadest, running clear over rounded stones in that particular way of mountain water that has a direction and a purpose and no interest in detours. The near bank was a wide, flat rock worn smooth by decades of water, exactly the right surface for what she had come to do. She set the bucket down and stood for a moment. She had not stood still in the open air for a month, not without a task immediately at hand or a destination immediately ahead. She had been moving since Boston, filling every available moment with motion and purpose, because motion and purpose were the two things that kept the other thing from having too much room. But this morning, with the water running and the birds doing their unhurried business in the trees above, and the light coming through the canopy in thin strips of gold, she stopped. She washed the clothes slowly, working through the rhythm of it, the soap and the scrubbing and the wringing and the piling, and somewhere in the middle of it, her mind went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet in a very long time. The way a room goes quiet when the last person who was busy in it finally sits down. She washed Cole's shirts and Seth's work trousers and the kitchen rags and the tablecloth, and then without particularly deciding to, she picked up the 2 shirts of Eli's that had been left in the basin and began washing those as well, because they were there and because in a house you take care of what surrounds you, and the responsibility for the things around you does not require a formal arrangement. She was on the 2nd shirt when it arrived the way it sometimes arrived without announcement. First a slow heat at the back of her neck, then the world tipping gently to one side. She pressed one hand against the cool, flat rock and breathed, counting, waiting. When it passed, she was still sitting, the shirt in her lap, the water running past her feet, and she was aware of something That was not the nausea and not the dizziness, but was underneath both of them, something she had been running from for months and had finally caught up with her here at this creek in this silence. She laid her hand flat against her abdomen. She stayed like that for a long time. The creek kept its count. The birds maintained their positions in the argument she was not party to. And what had been hovering at the edge of her conscious life for 10 weeks, circling and circling without landing, finally came to rest. This child had not asked for any of this, had not asked for a father who would one day have to be explained, or a mother who had fled 2,000 miles in the wrong season, or a start that it was composed more of desperation than design. This child had simply arrived, was simply becoming in the quiet and involuntary way that life arrives and becomes, insisting on nothing more complicated than the chance to continue. The tears came without drama. They came the way certain things come when you have been too busy surviving to let them come properly, sliding down her face in the silence of a woman who is not performing anything for anyone, not even herself. She cried the way the creek ran continuously and without announcement because the creek did not need an audience and neither did she. Cole Harlan stood in the trees above the creek bank and did not move. He had come down to check a rabbit snare he had set near the water 3 days ago, and he had come down quietly because he had learned early in life that the woods rewarded quietness, and he had seen her below him on the flat rock before she had heard him and he had stopped. He was not a man who eavesdropped or intruded on private things, but he was also not a man who walked away from someone in the moment they most needed a witness, even a witness they could not see. He stood in the trees. He stayed until she straightened and gathered herself and lifted the wash bucket and began the climb back up. He slipped away along the upper path before she reached the top. When she came in through the kitchen door 10 minutes later, there was a cup of tea on the table still steaming. Cole was standing at the stove with his back to her, doing something with the fire. She set the bucket down. She looked at the tea. "Thought you might need that," he said, not turning. "Cole," she said. Thank you." He made a sound that was acknowledgement without elaboration and went outside. She sat down with the tea and held it in both hands and let the warmth run through her palms and thought that there were different kinds of decency in the world, and this house had more than one variety of it. That afternoon, Eli was not in the field or the barn or the house. She found him at the end of the day, standing at the edge of the yard, looking north in the particular posture she had come to recognize as his listening posture, the posture he assumed when he was taking a reading of something that required full attention. She walked out and stood beside him. He did not look at her, but he did not seem surprised she was there. He pointed north where the mountains caught the last light in layers, the near ridge copper and the far ones going gray. "See the cloud at the top of the second ridge," he said, "the way it sits, not moving with the rest of the sky." She looked. "I see it." "That is not weather," he said. "That is the mountain cooling faster than the air around it and the moisture in the air finding the cold surface. By morning there will be frost on the high pasture." She looked at it for a while. "How do you learn that?" "By being wrong first," he said, "a great many times, and then by being right often enough that the pattern becomes available to you." He looked at the ridge for a moment more. "The land talks," he said, "in the same register as most things that matter. Too quiet to hear if you are making noise." She thought about that. "Winter always ends," she said after a moment, not to him specifically and not to herself specifically, but to the space between them which had become over 3 weeks, a space where certain things could be said without requiring a response. He looked at her, then briefly and directly. "Yes," he said, "it does." They stood in the last of the light until the mountains went dark, and then they went inside. The storm came in the third week of October, and it came the way serious mountain storms come, without the gradual buildup of something giving fair warning, but with the sudden full commitment of a thing that has been organizing itself out of sight and then arrives all at once. It began at midnight on a Wednesday with rain that drove horizontally against the boards of every structure on the property, and it escalated quickly into something louder and colder and considerably more thorough. Eli woke when it started. He lay still for a moment, listening to the rain on the roof and the creak, which had been a low, constant presence for weeks and was now something audible from inside with the windows closed. He got up, pulled on his boots, lit the lantern, and went to check the low ground. The barn was higher than the creek by 12 feet, which was adequate for most rains. The smokehouse was fine, the root cellar was elevated. The area behind the second corral, where the drainage from the north pasture ran through before reaching the creek, was already running fast and spreading. He crossed the yard through the rain to the barn. He knocked at the small door set into the main barn door, where the light was still visible through the gap at the bottom. Clara. The light shifted. The door opened. She was standing inside in her day clothes, which told him she had not been asleep, perhaps had not tried to sleep, which told him other things about how she was doing that he filed away to think about later. The creek will overtop its bank by morning, he said. The water will not reach the house, but it will reach the lower ground around the barn. You need to come inside. She looked at the rain behind him for a moment, then at the dark beyond the yard. I do not want to be a bother, she said, which was the third or fourth time she had said something of that variety, since arriving always in the moments when accepting help would have cost her nothing, and given her something she needed, which he had come to understand was a habit formed by years of being in situations where asking for things had consequences. You are not, he said, and he said it with the finality of a man who does not negotiate this kind of thing. There is a room. Come. She gathered what she needed in 2 minutes, which confirmed something he had already suspected, that she had learned to pack quickly and without excess, the way people learn when they have had to leave place before they were ready. He carried her bag and held the lantern, and they crossed the yard through the rain that was now heavy enough to find all the gaps in ordinary clothing within 30 seconds. The spare room was at the end of the upper hall past the landing and the other 2 bedrooms, and he had not opened it in 3 years, not for any practical purpose, not casually, not at all. He opened it now and held the lantern in to light the space before she entered. It was not a blank room. There was a curtain at the window that had once been bright and was now the honest, faded color of fabric left in a mountain house through many seasons. There was a small mirror and a chair that matched nothing else in the house and had been in that spot for as long as he could remember, for no reason he had ever been able to determine. And on the bed, folded back at the corner, as if the person who had last slept there had left in the morning expecting to return by evening, was a quilt. Clara stopped in the doorway. The quilt was made of dozens of small pieces of fabric, each one different, cut from what had clearly been a variety of garments, many colors and patterns assembled with patience and considerable skill into something that was entirely coherent, the kind of object that takes months to make properly, the kind that gets made in winter evenings when there is nothing else demanding hands and the fire is good. She looked at it without speaking for a moment. Then she looked at him. It was Margaret's, he said. He said it not because it needed to be said, but because not saying it seemed like a small dishonesty. She made it. Clara was quiet. She looked at the quilt again. Sleep here, he said. I am in the next room if anything is needed. He left and pulled the door most of the way closed and stood in the dark hallway for a moment, listening to the rain on the roof above him. Then he went to his own room and sat on the edge of his own bed in the dark with the lantern off, listening to the rain and to the creek below, and to the quiet of a house that had 2 people sleeping in it for the first time in 3 years, separated by a single wall in the thickness of time. He did not sleep for a long time, but it was not the sleeplessness of misery. It was the sleeplessness of a man who is in the presence of something new and is trying to take its measure honestly without hurry, without pretending to certainty he had not yet earned. Clara lay in the room that had been Margaret's and pulled the quilt up to her shoulders. It smelled of cedar from the chest it must have been stored in, and faintly and possibly only in her imagination of something else, something older, a fragrance she could not name. Under her hands the cloth was soft with use and care, the seams as tight as the day they were made. Winter always ends, she said quietly to the rain, and to the quilt, and to whatever remained in this room of the woman who had made it. She slept before the creek reached its highest point, and she slept deeply the way she had slept on that first night in the spare room, which was the sleep of a person who has finally, for the moment at least, stopped needing to keep one part of themselves awake. Cole came back from his ride into Millstone Creek the following Friday with a bundle of mail and a supply order and a sack of flour and a letter in a white envelope that had been sitting in the post office general delivery box addressed to a name he had not expected to see. He set it on the kitchen table without comment in the particular neutral way of a man depositing a fact rather than interpreting it. Clara saw it when she came in from the yard with the egg basket. She saw the handwriting on the front and the Boston postmark and the careful, deliberate script of a woman who wrote for another person as a professional obligation. And she knew it before she opened it the way, certain things before the confirmation arrives, because the body understands the shape of a threat before the mind has finished processing the specifics. She picked it up and went outside to the porch. She read it once, then she read it again more slowly, the way you read something when you want to be absolutely certain you are not misunderstanding it. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment, looking out past the yard at the tree line where the pines went dark and the light did not reach. The language was careful and the courtesy was impeccable. And underneath, both clear as water over stone, was the meaning that was not quite stated, but did not need to be stated, because the people who wrote letters like this understood that the most effective threats wore the costume of concern. The Aldrich family knew she had come west. They knew she was in Montana territory. They wanted her to understand that certain arrangements were being considered to ensure the welfare of whatever she might currently be carrying. They would expect a response. If no response was forthcoming within a reasonable period, they would take actions that the family felt were appropriate to the circumstances. Eli came around the corner of the house from the south pasture and stopped when he saw her standing on the porch with her face in the particular arrangement it was in, which was not fear and not grief, but the face of a person doing rapid and serious calculation. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her, and she held out the letter without speaking. He read it standing there. His face did not change in any dramatic way while he read it, which she had come to understand was not the same as the letter having no effect on him, but rather was the effect being absorbed and managed before it became visible, the way a deep foundation absorbs a heavy load without showing the effort in its surface. He folded the letter and held it for a moment, looking at the tree line. "His name," he said. "Clarence Aldrich," she said. "His family has money. They have lawyers in Boston and New York. He is not coming himself, not yet. But if I do not respond, what he is entitled to," Eli said with a quietness that was in no way mild, "and what he will receive are two different things." He said it not as a reassurance, but as a practical statement, the assessment of a man who has worked a piece of land for 20 years and understands what it means to hold ground. She looked at him. "Iron Ridge takes care of its own," he said. "That has not changed." He handed her the letter back and went inside and through the kitchen window. A few minutes later, she heard him speaking to Cole in a low, even voice, and she did not hear all of it, but she heard enough to understand that they were already working through what would need to be done. The way men who have kept a difficult piece of country alive through difficult years work through problems methodically and without panic, and with the steady, purposeful calm of people who have decided that whatever comes next, they are not moving. She stayed on the porch until the light changed, and the smell of the supper Cole was making came through the kitchen door in the creek below. The property went on with its perpetual accounting. And she thought about the letter in her hand and the man inside who had not asked her what she had done to bring this on herself, who had read a threat and immediately begun thinking about how to answer it. She thought about what Martha had said about a man who had decided to be larger than his grief. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went inside. The kitchen was warm. Cole was at the stove. Seth was at the table with a piece of harness leather and a long needle mending something with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Eli was at the window with his coffee, looking out at the yard, which was dark now, and still except for the wind in the yard pine. She took her seat at the table, and when Seth glanced up from his mending, she met his eyes for a moment, and he held them. And what passed between them was not warmth exactly, but something that was adjacent to it, the mutual acknowledgement of two people who have had one difficult, honest conversation and have arrived on the other side of it with something more solid between them than what was there before. "Supper in 10 minutes, Cole said. Outside, the night deepened over the ranch. The mountains stood in the dark to the north Iron Ridge, solid and immovable, carrying the weight of the sky the way they always had, without complaint, without request for acknowledgement, simply bearing what was theirs to bear. The creek ran, the fire held. Somewhere down the road and many seasons away, winter was already beginning to end. October deepened into November, and the light changed in the way that mountain light changes when the season turns in earnest, not gradually, but with a kind of decision to it, the sun dropping lower each morning and the shadows arriving earlier each afternoon, until the yard was in shade by 3 o'clock and the temperature dropped fast enough after that to remind you that the warmth of midday had never been a promise. Clara worked through it. She had always worked through things, and this was no different, except that her body now made certain demands on the working that had not existed before, small recalibrations required by the second life she was carrying. She used the lighter hose Seth had left without comment. She sat down on the low stool that had appeared in the kitchen beside the dry sink, which was the right height for the work that happened there, and which no one had used before because no one had been doing that work. She took her time on the stairs. She accepted these accommodations the way she had learned to accept the goodwill of this house, without making a ceremony of it and without pretending it was unnecessary. The mornings were still difficult, but shorter now. 5 minutes of steadying herself instead of 20, and Martha's herbs in the hot water before anything else helped, in the way that simple practical things help. When the body is doing something it has never done before and needs time to learn its own new requirements. She understood with increasing clarity, going to be all right. Not because nothing bad could happen, things could always happen, but because she was not alone with it anymore. And the difference between facing a hard thing alone and facing it with people around you who have decided you are worth facing it with is not a small difference. It is, in fact, most of the difference. The conversation about the name happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon when Seth and Eli were out on the north fence line, and the kitchen held only the two of them, and the sound of the fire and the wind working at the north window. Cole was at the table with a piece of worn leather and a small tool, repairing a strap with the focused patience he brought to everything he made with his hands. Clara was at the dry sink, working through the beans from the last garden harvest, sorting and cleaning. Neither of them was in a hurry about anything. It was that kind of afternoon. "Have you thought about names?" Cole said without looking up from the strap. She paused over the beans. "Some. And I thought about Whitfield," she said. "Whit for short. It was my grandfather's name." She separated a damaged bean from the pile. "He was a steady man, the kind you want a child to be named after." Cole turned the strap in his hands and examined his work. "Whitfield Harlan," he said, trying the combination the way you try a hinge to see if it swings correctly. "That is a name with some weight to it." "It is not a Harlan name yet," she said quietly. Cole set the leather down and looked at her in the direct way he used when he intended to say something that mattered. "It is a name for a child who is going to be raised on this land by the people who live here," he said. "That is what makes it a Harlan name, not blood." He picked the strap back up. "In my experience, blood is the least interesting thing about a family." She looked at the beans in front of her for a moment. "Whit," she said. "Good name," Cole said. They did not discuss it further, but the name had been said aloud in this kitchen, had been heard by the fire and the wind, and the old cast iron stove that held the warmth of many years of mornings, and now it existed in the room the way things exist once they have been named solidly, and without the possibility of being unnamed. The week after that conversation, on a late afternoon when the sky went copper and the shadows turned long and blue across the yard, Eli came to find her at the edge of the property where the ground began to slope toward the creek. She had been standing there for no particular reason, except that she had finished what she was doing and had not yet started the next thing. And the light was extraordinary in the specific way it is extraordinary in the mountains at this hour, The kind of light that makes it seem briefly possible that everything is going to be fine. He came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then he pointed toward the creek, which was audible from here, but not visible through the screen of willows at the bottom of the slope. Listen, he said. She listened. The sound it makes now, he said. Notice the register of it. She closed her eyes. The creek ran in its constant voice below them, and she had heard it every night since arriving, had absorbed it the way you absorb the background sounds of a place until they become invisible. The way you stop hearing your own breathing. Now, he said, in 3 weeks, maybe 4, when the temperature drops below a certain point for several nights in a row, the creek will change. The upper reaches will begin to ice. The water volume will drop, and the speed will change, and the sound will rise a half step, thinner, more urgent. She kept her eyes closed. How do you hear that? You stop listening for something specific, he said. You just listen. Let it tell you what it is instead of asking it to confirm what you already think. She opened her eyes and looked at the willows moving in the slight evening wind. That is not just about the creek, she said. He looked at her sideways, not quite a smile, but a thing in the same direction. No, he said, it is not just about the creek. They stood together in the last of the copper light, not close, not far. Two people who had arrived at a proximity that was not yet named but was nonetheless real, and the creek ran below them with its patient voice saying what it said and waiting for whoever was ready to hear it. Winter always ends, she said quietly. Yes, he said, and before it ends, it teaches you what you are made of. She thought about that for a long time after she went inside. The dogs heard them first. It was a Thursday afternoon in the middle of December, and the first real snow of the season had fallen 2 days prior and was now settled over the yard. In the fencing and the roof of the barn, in the clean, flat way of early season snow, before the wind has had a chance to sculpt it into anything more complicated. The air was cold enough to make the breath visible and to make the particular silence of a snowed-in landscape, that muffled, attentive quiet in which small sounds carry farther than usual. Seth's dog, a gray and tan hound of serious disposition, who distinguished between arrivals he expected and arrivals he did not, began its specific sequence of alarm at 2:15, standing at the gate and projecting in the direction of the road below. Seth heard it from the barn and came out. Eli heard it from the north pasture and started back toward the house. Cole heard it from the woodpile and set down the axe. The vehicle that appeared at the foot of the lane was a hired carriage, of the type used by people who had money enough to hire things in unfamiliar territories. Black, well-appointed, and deeply out of place, on a road that had last seen a hired carriage, not at all. 2 horses, both blowing steam into the cold air with the exertion of the uphill mile from the main road. A driver on the box with the expression of a man who had been asked to go considerably farther into the wilderness than his usual arrangements required. The man who stepped down from the carriage door was approximately 28 years old and was wearing a wool overcoat that had not been made for Montana winters, but had been made with enough quality that it had survived the journey without becoming shapeless. His boots were fine and entirely wrong for the ground. His face had the particular surface quality of a man who had been comfortable for his entire life and was experiencing for perhaps the first time the sensation of standing in a place that was not impressed by him. He had to tip his head back to look at Seth Harlan. He looked then at Eli, who had come from the far side of the barn and was now standing to Seth's right, and at Cole, who had come from the woodpile and had not put down the axe, which he simply carried in a natural hand at his side because he had been using it and had no particular reason to set it down. 3 men, 3 different heights, 3 different silences, one shared quality of absolute stillness. I'm looking for a woman named Clara Whitmore, the man said. His voice was practiced and smooth and had the projection of someone trained to speak in rooms where he expected to be listened to. I have information that she is on this property. Who told you that? Eli said. I employed someone to find out. He reached into his interior coat pocket and produced an envelope. My name is Clarence Aldrich. I believe you may have heard it recently. I have documents from my family's legal representation in Boston relating to a matter of which state, Seth said. Aldrich paused. I beg your pardon. Which state did those documents come from? Seth said in the tone of a man who is not asking a rhetorical question. Massachusetts, but the legal precedent. This is Montana territory, Seth said. Those papers have no standing here. Aldrich's jaw moved. He was recalibrating. Clara could see it from where she stood, which was on the porch of the house, because she had heard and had gone to the door and understood immediately who had arrived and why, and she had made the decision in the time it took to reach the porch that she was not going inside. She was not going to be somewhere she could not see what was happening. She had spent enough months in a state of managed not seeing. She was done with that. She was standing at the top of the porch steps with her coat on and her hands quiet at her sides, and the cold air very clear around her and the snow very white in the yard. Aldrich saw her. Something moved in his face that she did not want to classify because it was not the expression of a man who had come because he cared about something. It was the expression of a man who had come because he had located a piece of business that needed to be settled and was relieved to have found it. Clara, he said, the familiarity of it was its own kind of statement. Mr. Aldrich, she did not move from the step. My family wants to make sure you are properly situated. We are prepared to be extremely generous. Your family is afraid, she said. The cold air carried her voice clearly across the yard. They are afraid of a child who might carry your name without being where your family can arrange it. That is what this is. His expression tightened. You are being unreasonable. If you would only consider the child's welfare, the child's name is no concern of yours, she said. And the child's welfare is the reason I am here and not in Boston. I have legal standing as the father. You have nothing here, Eli said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality of a wall encountering a question about whether it was a wall. He stepped forward one pace, not to crowd the man, but to be unambiguous about where he was standing, which was between Clarence Aldrich and the porch. The child has a name and a house, and people who intend to keep it, Eli said. That is what the law here cares about. What you have in your pocket is paper from a place 2,000 miles from here, and it does not change what is true on this land. Aldrich looked at Eli. He looked at Seth, whose gray eyes had not shifted from him since he stepped out of the carriage. He looked at Cole, who had still not put down the axe, not as a threat, but simply as a fact of what a working man carries when he has been interrupted. Three men standing in the snow in front of a gate that was not open on land, that was not his, in a territory that operated by rules he had not thought to research before arriving. He tried once more. The law of paternity. I am the father, Eli said. The yard went very still. Aldrich stared at him. Eli Harlan stood in the December snow at 43 years old and said a thing that was not technically true in the biological sense and was entirely true in every sense that the word father actually requires. And he said it with the calm of a man who has thought about a thing long enough that saying it aloud is simply the exterior expression of an interior certainty that has already been established. He did not look at Clara when he said it. He looked at Clarence Aldrich. The child is mine, he said. We are a family on this land. You have no business here. Something went out of Aldrich then. Not dramatically, not with the force of a thing breaking, but with the slow deflation of a position that has been undermined at its foundation. He was a man accustomed to rooms where his name opened doors to conversations where the weight of his family's money was the largest thing present. He was not accustomed to standing in the cold outside a gate that was not opening, being looked at by three men who were simply not going to move. He put the envelope back in his pocket. He turned toward the carriage. He said something to his companion that she could not hear from the porch. The driver turned the horses on the narrow lane with some difficulty and considerably more backing than the situation would have required with a less fine and less impractical vehicle, and the carriage went back down the lane in the same direction it had come and disappeared into the pines below, and the sound of it faded and was gone. Seth watched until the sound was fully gone. Then he turned and walked toward the barn. Cole set the axe against the fence post. He looked at Eli for a moment, and then at Clara on the porch, and then he went inside because Cole Harlan understood when a room needed to have fewer people in it. Eli crossed the yard. He walked in his unhurried way, the way he always walked, as if the distance between here and where he was going had been accounted for in advance and required no adjustment. He came to the foot of the porch steps and stopped and looked up at her. The late afternoon light was the particular gold of December at low latitude, the kind that makes everything briefly more vivid than its usual self, and it caught the frost on the porch rail and the steam of his breath and the amber of his eyes and held them all in the same flat illumination. She had not cried. She was not going to cry. But something in her chest was doing something complicated that was not quite crying and not quite relief and was not entirely either of those things. She stepped down one step. He did not move. She laid her hand on his arm, just her hand resting on the rough wool of his coat, not gripping, not demanding, just making contact. Then she lowered her head until her forehead was against his shoulder. The wool was rough and cold and solid. His shoulder did not move. It was there the way the mountains were there, simply and completely as a fact of the landscape that had never promised to be anything other than what it was. "You are home now," he said quietly into the cold air above her head. She heard it land. She let it stay where it landed. They stood on the steps of the Iron Ridge house in the December cold, with the snow white around them, and the pines black beyond the fence, and the mountains holding everything in their old, dark patience, and the creek ran below in its winter voice, thinner now, just as he had said it would be, and she had learned by then to hear what it was saying. She was home. The calendar turned. December gave way to January, in January to February, with the particular grinding quality of a Montana winter, in full authority, the kind of cold that is not hostile, but is simply thorough, covering everything that it reaches and not releasing anything until it is ready to release it. The house held its warmth because Eli had built it to hold warmth, because the logs were thick and the chinking was sound and the stoves were well made and well tended. The wood stacks did not diminish faster than expected because Seth had cut through autumn with the focused thoroughness of a man who understood that preparation was the only argument worth making to a Montana winter. Clara understood with a clarity that had nothing sentimental in it ready. She felt wit moving in the first week of December, and this was she understood from Martha's guidance exactly when she should feel it, and she lay still in the nights, and felt it with her hand flat against her side, and thought about her grandfather, who had been a steady man, and about all the people whose names had been passed down through time to her, and through her forward to a child who would soon need a name of his own to carry. She told Eli about it one morning over coffee. She said simply that she could feel the baby moving and that it felt like certainty, which was not the word she had expected to use, but was the one that was there. He looked at her across the table, and he was quiet for a moment in his particular way, and then he said that he was glad, and he said it in the way he said things that mattered, with no decoration and no diminishment, and it was exactly enough. Seth began checking the stairs in January, not conspicuously, but consistently, the way he did everything that he considered his responsibility to maintain, which was more things than he would ever articulate. He silently replaced a riser on the third step from the bottom that had a crack in it she had not noticed. He moved the heavy water bucket from its position inside the back door to a lower shelf so she would not have to bend at an angle that had begun to be awkward. He said nothing about any of these adjustments, and she said nothing either, and the silence around them was the same contract it had always been. Cole made the crib in February. He made it in the workshop he had established in the southeast corner of the barn, out of seasoned pine, working in the evenings with a lamp set on the workbench and the particular focused quiet of a craftsman doing something he wanted to do correctly. He did not announce he was making it. One morning in the second week of February, it appeared in the room at the end of the hall, assembled and sanded and fitted with a small mattress covered in flour sack linen that Adeline Becker from the town dry goods had cut and stuffed with clean wool and stitched closed with red thread at the corners. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at it. The crib sat in the room that had been Margaret's, next to the bed in the angle of the wall and the window in the morning light that came through the faded curtain and fell on the quilt that was still on the bed, because no one had suggested otherwise, and because it was a beautiful thing that deserved to be where light could find it. She could not speak for a moment. She stood with her hand on the door frame. Cole was somewhere downstairs, making no particular sound, asking nothing. "Iron Ridge takes care of its own," she said quietly to the room in the crib in the light. The room held the words and did not give them back. The night Whitfield Harlan was born was a Wednesday in the first week of March, 3 weeks before the creek found its spring voice, and the frost went out of the high pasture, and the first tentative green appeared at the edges of the south field. It began at 2 in the morning. Clara woke with it and knew it immediately the way she had been told by Martha. She would know it, not the practiced contractions of the past 2 weeks, but the thing itself, the serious and organized rhythm of a body that has been building toward a single moment for 9 months and has finally decided that the moment is now. She lay still and counted. She had been counting every morning and evening for 2 weeks the way Martha had instructed, so she had a baseline and could measure the change in it. She counted for 20 minutes. There was no ambiguity. She rose and dressed carefully in the dark. She knocked on Eli's door. He opened it before the second knock. He looked at her for 1 second and understood completely. "How long?" he said. "Since 2, about 15 minutes between." He turned back into the room and she heard him pull on his boots and his coat without sitting down. He was back in under a minute. "I'm going to wake Cole," he said. "Cole rides for Martha. You go back to your room and I will stay downstairs until she arrives." "I can sit in the kitchen." "Then sit in the kitchen," he said without argument. "I will have the stove up." The ride to Millstone Creek in early March on a road still uncertain from the melt was 15 miles, and it was dark, and Cole did it at the speed that the road allowed, which was not the speed he wanted but was the speed available to him. And he arrived at Martha Goodwin's door at 3:45 and knocked in the way you knock when something has begun that cannot wait for morning. Martha opened the door in her dressing gown with her white hair loose and her eyes already clear. Because she had over 50 years of this work trained herself to wake into full attention the same way certain animals wake completely and without a period of transition. She looked at Cole. She said, "Put the horse in the back and wait while I dress." They were back at Iron Ridge by 5:30. Eli and Seth were on the porch. They had not planned to be there together. Eli had been in the kitchen with Clara until Martha arrived and sent him out, and Seth had woken at the sound of hooves in the yard and had dressed and come down and found nothing useful to do inside and had therefore come outside, and they had both ended up on the porch without particularly deciding to end up there the way the Harlan brothers often ended up in the same place without a stated arrangement. Cole joined them when he had seen to the horse. 3 men on a porch in the early March dark, sitting and standing and being quiet, which was the only language available for this kind of waiting. The cold was sharp, but not bitter. The stars were out the clear, many-starred sky of a mountain night. After the weather has passed, each point of light, specific and in its place. The creek was beginning to find its spring register, slightly fuller and slightly faster than it had been through the deepest part of the winter. And if you knew how to listen for it, you could hear the difference, the particular tone of water that has been released from something and is moving again. Seth, after a long silence, said something. He said it to the yard in the dark and the porch rail. Not to either of his brothers specifically in the way of a man saying something he has been carrying long enough that it has begun to weigh more than he wants it to weigh. "I was wrong about her," he said, "when she first came. I measured her against a wrong measure. That was not fair." Neither of his brothers said anything immediately. "She stood in that barn," Seth said, "and she did not back down. I tried to make her back down." He looked at his hands. She did not. Cole looked at the sky for a moment. "She does not back down from much," he said. "No," Seth said, "she does not." Eli was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You decided right when it mattered. That is what counts." Seth received this in the particular way he received things, turning it over briefly and then placing it where it needed to go. He nodded once and then he was quiet again, and the three of them returned to the waiting, which was what they had. The hours pass, the way hours pass when you are waiting for something that has no fixed arrival time, unevenly, some minutes slow and some fast, and all of them requiring the patience of people who have learned that the things worth waiting for cannot be hurried. The sky lightened by degrees, the stars faded one range at a time, the western ones first, the eastern ones last, and the mountains emerged from the dark in their familiar shapes, and then the sky was the pale gray that comes before even the first color of dawn, the color of something holding its breath. And then in the particular silence between one breath of wind and the next, from inside the house through the logs and the plaster and the years of accumulated warmth and grief and work, and beginning again came a sound. It was thin and high and precise, and entirely itself the sound of someone who had just arrived somewhere and was letting the world know about it, with complete conviction and not a trace of hesitation. Eli closed his eyes. He stood on the porch with his eyes closed and the first gray light of a March morning on his face, and the voice of a new person coming from inside his house, and he let it arrive. Let it be what it was. Let the chest tighten and the throat do what it was doing, and all of the accumulated weight of 3 years of a particular kind of silence find in this small, thin voice from inside the house something that it had not expected to find. Not replacement, not repair, not the filling in of a shape that had been left empty. Something different. Something that did not require the space where Margaret was to be anything other than what it was. Something that occupied its own space entirely new, asking for nothing except to be heard. He opened his eyes. Cole was looking at the mountains. His jaw was set and his eyes were bright. Seth had his head down, turned slightly, weighing his broad shoulders, doing something quiet and private. "Welcome to Iron Ridge," Cole said to no one and everyone, to the morning and the mountains, and the voice still going inside the house. "Welcome to Iron Ridge, boy." Martha Goodwin opened the porch door 20 minutes later. She had a cloth in her hands and the expression of a woman who has just done something she has done hundreds of times and each time found worth doing. She looked at Eli. "A son," she said, "healthy, strong lungs, as I am sure you heard." The edges of her eyes held the particular quality that the eyes of people who do this work often hold: the knowledge of what it costs and what it gives, and the impossibility of separating those two things. "She is well. She did well." She stepped aside and held the door. "Go in, Eli." He went in. The kitchen was warm and quiet, the lamp on the table giving a yellow light that fell on the familiar surfaces of the room, the same table, the same stove, the same shelves that had held the same things all winter. All of it the same, and none of it quite the same, because something had shifted in the house in the last 3 hours that was not visible in any of the objects it contained, but was unmistakably present. He went up the stairs. She was lying in the room that had been Margaret's, in the bed with the quilt across her, and she was pale with the honest pallor of hard work completed, and her hair was damp at her temples, and her eyes were open, and they were the blue he had been seeing across kitchen tables and along fence lines and at the edge of creek banks for 6 months, and they were brighter than he had ever seen them. In her arms, wrapped in the white flannel that Martha had brought in her bag, was someone very small. Eli crossed the room. He stood beside the bed and looked down at the child. The face was the face of a newborn, which is a face without precedent, ancient and entirely new. At the same time, the nose still flat and the cheeks still working out their final arrangement. And the eyes, when they opened, a dark blue that had not yet decided what it would eventually become. He was small. He was completely formed. He had his fists clenched at either side of his face in the way of new arrivals who are already preparing to take hold of whatever is offered. "This is wit," Clara said. Her voice was low and exhausted and absolutely certain. Eli looked at the child for a long time. "May I?" he said. She shifted slightly and he reached down and lifted the child with the careful thoroughness of a man who has handled many fragile things in his life and understands that careful does not mean tentative. He settled the weight of him against his chest, the warm, small, insistent weight of a person who has been somewhere very compact and has just been given considerably more room and is still deciding what to do with it. Whit opened his eyes. They found Eli's face. Not with recognition, because recognition requires a history, but with attention, the focused, open attention of a creature encountering something for the first time and giving it the full consideration it deserved. Then Witt's right arm moved the deliberate and purposeful movement of someone who has already concluded that the world is a place where you reach for what you need, and his small hand found Eli's thumb and closed around it. The grip was extraordinary. For a person 3 hours old and 7 pounds of weight, the grip was extraordinary. It had the quality of intention in it, of something decided rather than accidental, a hand that had closed around a thumb and was communicating in the clearest terms available that it had found what it was looking for and had no plans to release it. Eli looked at that hand. He looked at it for a long time, this hand the size of a walnut that had found him in the yellow lamplight of a March morning and decided that he would do. This hand that had no idea what he had been carrying for 3 years or what it had cost him to stand on a porch in December and say the words he had said. This hand that did not care about any of that and was not offering him anything as complicated as forgiveness or consolation. It was just a hand. It was just a grip. It was just a person who had arrived and found someone to hold on to and held on. That was all. That was entirely enough. Whit, Eli said quietly to the child and to the lamplight and to the morning beginning outside the window. Whitfield Harlan. He turned the name in his mouth the way you turn a good piece of work in your hands to confirm that it is what you thought it was. You are home now. Clara looked at him from the bed, and her eyes were the blue of a Montana sky. After the weather has cleared, and she said nothing because there was nothing that required saying. And in this house they had all learned that the things which required nothing said were often the things that most needed to be honored by that silence. She watched the largest man she had ever known stand in the yellow lamplight of a mountain morning, holding a child the size of his two hands together, and she thought about a short advertisement in the back pages of a back copy of a newspaper, and a man who had used the word decency in a 2,000-mile journey toward a life she had not been able to imagine when she began it. She thought about solid ground. She had it now. Seth came in when Cole told him it was time. Seth came up the stairs and stood in the doorway of the room and looked at Eli with the child and then at Clara in the bed. He came to the side of the bed. He did not make a speech. He looked at the child in Eli's arms, at the face still working out its arrangements, at the fists unclenched now, one of them still wrapped around Eli's thumb. Whit, Seth said, trying the name. It sat correctly. It had the right amount of weight for a name that would need to carry a person through a Montana life. He extended one finger toward the child's open hand. Whit's hand closed around it with the same decisive grip it had used on Eli's thumb, and Seth looked at that small hand around his finger and was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a man whose considerable defenses have just been bypassed by something too small and too straightforward to be defended against. He cleared his throat. He straightened up. "I will start breakfast," he said, and went back down the stairs. Cole appeared in the doorway where Seth had been. He looked at Eli and the child and then at Clara, and he smiled fully, the kind of smile he did not always let go all the way to the surface, and said nothing because Cole Harlan was very good at knowing when what a moment needed was not words, but the acknowledgement of a person who was glad to be present for it. He went back downstairs. Eli stood a while longer in the lamplight with Whit against his chest. The sky outside the window was going from gray to the first pale rose of a mountain dawn, and the creek below the property was running at its March volume, full of the melt from the high snowpack, saying what it said in its particular March voice, which was fuller and more urgent than the winter voice and would be different again by June. He had taught her to hear it. He thought she probably could now. He settled the child back into her arms with the same careful thoroughness with which he had lifted him, and Whit made a small sound of protest at the transition and then settled against his mother and was quiet. Eli looked at Clara. "You did well," he said, which was the highest form of praise available in this house, and she knew it by now and received it accordingly. She was already mostly asleep, the deep, immediate sleep of a body that has finished an extraordinary thing and requires rest before anything else is possible. Her hand was flat against the child, and her eyes had closed, and her face in the yellow lamp, and the beginning dawn was the face of a person who has finally genuinely arrived. He extinguished the lamp. He left the door open on his way out so the warmth of the hall could reach the room, and he went downstairs to where Seth was at the stove, and Cole was at the table, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the beginning of a morning, and outside the window the mountains stood in the first light of a March day with their ancient patient stillness. Iron Ridge takes care of its own, Seth said, without looking up from the stove in the same tone he might use to observe that the weather was clear or the horses needed water, which was to say in the tone of something that is simply and permanently true and requires no argument. Eli poured his coffee. Yes, he said, it does. The day began. Spring came to Iron Ridge the way spring always came, not with a declaration, but with an accumulation of small, undeniable facts. The creek found its fuller voice. The frost went out of the south field. The first green appeared at the edges of the garden Clara had cleared the previous autumn, thin and tentative and entirely certain of itself. The horses grew restless in their stalls. The days lengthened by minutes, and the minutes added up until one morning in April, Eli stood in the yard at 6 in the evening with daylight still on the mountains and understood that the season had genuinely turned. He found Clara at the edge of the garden with Whit in the crook of one arm, the child 6 weeks old now, and already more present in the world than newborns usually trouble to be, looking at everything with that dark-eyed seriousness that would in the years ahead make people who met him for the first time think he was older than he was. She was looking at the turned earth in the new green, with an expression he had come to know well over the winter, the expression of a person taking a careful account of what is actually in front of them before deciding what to make of it. He stopped beside her. I want to tell you something, she said without looking up from the garden. All right. Before I came here, I had learned to hold everything lightly, she said, because holding things lightly was the only way to survive losing them. She looked at Whit in her arm, the serious dark eyes catching the April light. And then he arrived, and I could not hold him lightly. He would not allow it. She looked up at Eli then, and her eyes held the same directness they had held on the day she stepped down from the stagecoach. But it was different now, the directness of a person who has nothing left to manage or conceal. In this place, I cannot hold it lightly either. He was quiet the way he was quiet when something required him to be fully present before he responded. I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go, she said. I want you to know that. I am staying because this is where I choose to be. The April evening settled around them, the light going long and golden over the garden rows, the creek running below with its spring voice, the mountains doing what they had always done, which was simply to be there in a way that made everything in front of them feel held. I know, he said. She looked at him for a moment, and something passed between them that did not require language and did not try to borrow any. They stood in the last of the light, and the garden waited for the seeds they would put into it, and the season moved forward as seasons do without asking whether anyone was ready. A month later, on a morning in May when the wildflowers had begun to appear along the creek bank, and the ranch held the warmth of a mountain spring that had finally decided to commit Eli, and Clara rode into Millstone Creek alone without Cole or Seth, which was itself a kind of statement. They stood before the justice of the peace in the small office at the end of the main street. The ceremony was brief, the language plain, the room unremarkable. Seth was outside with the horses, and Cole was inside standing beside Clara. With Whit in his arms, the child dressed in the best of what Clara had stitched for him over the winter, looking at the ceiling with the philosophical patience of a person who has not yet acquired opinions about public ceremonies. When the justice reached the words that spoke of endurance and permanence, Eli looked at Clara and she looked back, and what passed between them in that moment was not the starry-eyed hope of people beginning something, but the quieter and more durable thing of people who have already been tested by the same winter and are choosing to continue into the next one together. He placed a plain band on her finger. She had told him she did not need anything elaborate, and he had heard her correctly because it was exactly the right ring for a woman who had learned to trust what was solid over what was decorative. Outside, Seth held the horses and looked at the mountains and said nothing which was entirely appropriate. Cole came out with wit and told the child in the serious tone he used for important announcements that the family was now official, which Wit received with the same equanimity he brought to most things. They rode home in the afternoon light, Eli and Clara side by side on the familiar road through the pines, the mountains visible ahead between the tree crowns, the ranch waiting at the end of the long downward curve. The years came and went the way years do when you are living in them not as milestones, but as seasons, each one complete in itself and continuous with all the others. The garden produced abundantly in the summer of that first full year, the dark turned earth, giving back what had been put into it with the uncomplicated generosity of soil that has been tended correctly. Clara canned and dried and stored with a thoroughness that Seth noted without saying so, met his own standards for preparation, which were high. Wit grew with the speed that children use when they have decided to make up for their quiet beginning. By the following December, he was pulling himself upright against the kitchen table legs and regarding the distance to the stove with the calculating expression of a person doing geometry. On a Sunday afternoon in the second week of the month, with all four adults assembled in the kitchen for no reason, except that the cold outside made the warmth inside unusually appealing, he let go of the table leg and took 3 deliberate steps toward Eli, who was seated in the chair by the stove and arrived without falling. Eli caught him by the instinct of a man whose hands have always known what to do with things that need steadying, and Wit laughed the wordless laugh of someone who has just accomplished the first significant thing of his life and is unreservedly pleased about it. Seth from the doorway made a sound through his nose that Cole recognized as the sound Seth made when he was not going to acknowledge being moved. Cole did not bother to conceal it. He laughed freely the way he had always laughed when the Harlan house had something to laugh about. Rose came in the spring of 1876, born in the same room where Wit had been born, with the same March dawn breaking through the faded curtain, and Martha Goodwin's capable hands, and Eli waiting on the porch with his brothers until the thin, high voice of announcement came through the logs and the years of accumulated living inside them. Her name was Rose for Clara's mother, and she arrived in the world with a disposition that made it immediately clear she intended to use every day she was given. Where Wit was quiet and observant, Rose was vocal and decisive, and the combination of the two of them filled the Iron Ridge house with a quality of sound and motion that it had not held in many years, and that suited it. It turned out very well. Eli moved through this differently than he had expected to. He had not known before Wit's hand closed around his thumb on that March morning that he had room for this. He had believed without examining the belief very closely that the space where Margaret and the lost child were was the same space where everything of that kind lived, and that the space was occupied and therefore unavailable. He had been wrong about that. What he found instead was that the space where Margaret was remained entirely her own and undisturbed, and that what Wit and Rose and Clara occupied was different space entirely, space he had not known he had until it was filled. He did not speak about this directly because direct speech was not how the Harlans managed their interior lives. But it showed in how he moved through the house with a quality of presence that had not been there before, and attention to the small daily things that people who have lost important things often develop the understanding that the small daily things are not small at all. Cole found Adeline Becker in the spring of '78, or perhaps she found him the accounting being somewhat unclear in the telling. She was the daughter of the man who ran the dry goods in Millstone Creek, sharp-eyed and practical, and possessed of an inexhaustible capacity for tolerating Cole's habit of taking on more carpentry projects than any reasonable person had time for. They married the following autumn at Iron Ridge with the whole of Millstone Creek in attendance, and a table of food that Clara and Adeline produced together over 3 days that became in the memory of everyone who ate it the benchmark against which all subsequent ranch cooking was measured. Seth did not find a wife. He did not, so far as anyone could determine, look for one. He built himself a corner of the expanded house that was unmistakably his own, and he settled into the life of a man who has decided that his purpose is the place itself, the land and the fences and the animals and the people who belong to it. And he was satisfied with that in a way that needed no apology and received none. He taught Whit to read the sky when the boy was 7, sitting with him on the porch steps on the same evenings that Eli had once sat with Clara, pointing north toward the ridge and explaining the language of clouds in the same plain terms. Whit absorbed it with the focused attention of a child who has grown up understanding that the land around him has things to say and that paying attention to them is not optional. The hard years came as they always do. A late frost in '79 that took half the kitchen garden and required a lean winter of careful management. A summer in '82 of insufficient rain that dropped the cattle weight and produced a fall of diminished returns. A December that same year when Whit came in from the pasture, flushed and unsteady, and spent 3 days in bed with a fever that made the house very quiet and very watchful, and then broke on the fourth morning and left him thinner and pale, but entirely himself. Claire sat beside his bed through the worst of it. Eli came in the nights and sat on the other side. Neither of them said much. There was not much to say. They did what was in their power to do, and they waited, and the mountain did not intervene in human illness one way or another. But the creek ran, and the stove held, and the house was warm. And on the morning the fever broke, Eli looked across the bed at Clara with an expression she had no specific name for, but recognized as the expression of a man who has learned to be grateful for the continuation of things. The ranch grew, more fencing, more cattle, a second barn for the expanding herd, a workshop that Cole expanded 3 times as his reputation for fine carpentry spread, and people began coming from as far as Helena with commissions. Iron Ridge became the kind of place that has a name in the surrounding country, not because it is grand, but because it is consistently and reliably itself the kind of place you can count on to be where it was the last time you looked. 30 years is a long time, and it is not a long time depending on how you measure it. You can measure it in years, which gives you a number. You can measure it in seasons, which gives you a pattern. You can measure it in the faces of children becoming adults and then becoming parents themselves, which gives you something that numbers and patterns cannot fully hold. Whit Harlan, 29 years old in the autumn of 1903, had his father's build and his mother's eyes and a way of moving through the land around him that was all Iron Ridge, the particular ease of a person who has been taught since childhood to listen before they speak and to look before they step. He had taken a wife 2 years prior, Adeline Connolly from town, a quiet and capable woman who had observed the Iron Ridge household for years before joining it, and arrived with a clear-eyed understanding of what she was coming into, which made her an excellent fit. Their son Beckett, who was 3 years old and had recently discovered that the world contained cows and horses and dogs, and all of them were potentially interesting, held Whit's hand as they crossed the yard on an October afternoon, with the light going the particular gold it went. In that season, the same gold that had been falling on this yard for 30 years of October afternoons. Seth, 68 years old and no slower than the land required him to be, sat on the porch steps with Beckett in the following weeks and explained the sky to him in the same plain terms he had used with Whit, pointing north toward the ridge and speaking of clouds and wind and the language of things that do not speak in words. Beckett listened with the focused attention that the Harlan children seemed to arrive already equipped with, and Seth, who had never made a speech about loving anything, loved that child in the way that only people who are very consistent and very present and never say so are capable of loving. Cole, 62, now had slowed somewhat at the carpentry but had not stopped. His workshop held a smell of cedar and pine shavings that had become for everyone on the property as fundamental to Iron Ridge as the smell of coffee and wood smoke and the sound of the creek. He and Adeline had raised 3 children of their own in the north wing of the expanded house, and those children had grown and scattered and came back for the harvest and the holidays and brought their own children, and the table that Clara had once set for four now required additional boards laid across the sawhorses that Cole kept in the barn for exactly this purpose. On a Tuesday morning in September of 1903, exactly 30 years after a hired stagecoach had pulled to the side of the main street in Millstone Creek, and a young woman with honey-colored hair and cornflower blue eyes had stepped down carefully into a life she had not yet imagined. Clara Harlan stood at the edge of the kitchen garden at dusk and looked at what she had spent 3 decades growing. The garden was larger now, 4 times the size of the cleared rows she had first knelt in with aching knees in the September of 1873, and all of it productive, and all of it tended, all of it speaking the language of a place that has been cared for long enough that the caring has become the place itself. She heard his step behind her and did not need to turn. Eli came and stood beside her. He was 73 years old, and the silver had completed its work on his hair, and his face had deepened further into the lines of a man who had lived every year of his life outdoors and had not considered this any particular hardship. His hands were the same hands they had always been, large and calloused, incapable, and one of them found hers in the fading light without ceremony, the way it had been finding hers for many years. They stood looking at the garden and the mountains behind it, and the first stars beginning to show themselves in the eastern sky. From the house came the sound of Beckett and the other grandchildren running through the yard, and the sound of Whit's voice calling something across the pasture, and the smell of Adeline's cooking coming through the kitchen window, and Seth's voice on the far side of the barn saying something to someone in the tone he used when he was not going to acknowledge being fond of them. "I remember stepping off that stagecoach," Clara said. He listened. "I had 2 trunks and a bag and a letter I had read until the folds were going soft." She watched the light finish on the garden. "I thought I was choosing a direction. I had no idea I was choosing a life." He was quiet for a long moment in the way that meant he was giving the statement the consideration it deserved. "You are home now," he said. He had said it first in December of 1873 on the porch steps in the snow. He had been saying it in different ways ever since, in the hoe left against the fence and the creek lessons, and the words spoken at the gate when a man from Boston had come with papers that meant nothing on this land. "You have been for 30 years. She turned the words over and let them settle. The mountains stood to the north the way they had always stood, without promise or performance, simply occupying their place in the world, with the permanence of things that have been there longer than any of the arrangements of human happiness, and will be there long after." The creek ran below in its autumn voice. The stars came out one by one, and then all at once, the way they did on clear October nights in Montana, filling the sky with a density of light that made the dark seem less absolute. "Iron Ridge takes care of its own," she said. "Yeah," he said, "it does." The house behind them held its warmth and its noise and its generations, all of it built from the same materials that everything real is built from: time and work, and the accumulated daily choosing of people who have decided that this is the place and these are the people and they are going to stay. The creek ran, the mountains held, the light went all the way out, and it was enough.